Hi, and welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. This podcast is a place where we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And my guest today is Dr. Carey King from the University of Texas. You're a research scientist at the Energy Institute at the University of Texas. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk about your new book, The Economic Superorganism, today, Beyond the Competing Narratives on Energy, Growth, and Policy. But what I do on this podcast is have guests introduce themselves. I've given you a partial introduction here. Maybe I blew the intro here, but nevertheless, our bias is have you introduce yourself as though you've just arrived at, say, a dinner party, or you're a guest at a function, and you're introducing yourself, and you have 45 seconds. Go tell who are you? Why are you here?
Right. Yeah. So I'm Carey King, Central Texas native, born and bred, and still living here. But I'd like to say my mind and thoughts have expanded far beyond just thinking about one location, and thinking about the globe now, and the global economy and the global energy system. So those are my interests. My background is in engineering, degrees from UT Austin, and I now still work there. But I spent the last 10 years since I've been working back at UT after graduating on understanding the role of energy in the economy, and from a fundamental, what we would call biophysical economic standpoint, trying to understand how the physical principles of the economy are actually affecting social outcomes, even though people might not think of it that way. So I think this is a different approach, and an approach that needs to be promoted and discussed, as opposed to just thinking about the economy as purely a mental and kind of construct of prices floating around. There's a physical nature of the economy behind it that's governing things. So
Okay.
that's what I like to work on.
Sure. Okay, so your new book is the Economic Superorganism, Beyond the Competing Narratives on Energy, Growth, and Policy. So why this book, and why now? What is the message? What's the fundamental message of this book, and why is it? Why should people read it?
Right. A lot of this book is summarizing research that's been talked about and done by others over perhaps decades, we might even say, and since the 70s. The motivation is to show how, in some sense, the background on how most economic models that are used, we might say mainstream or neoclassical economic thinking, is actually kind of misleading us as to the role of energy in the economy. And this leads to misleading policy, and for things, including things like going low carbon for climate change. So I like to say that, there's a physical basis of the economy, and these form constraints on and largely define what the economy is. Energy resources are physically powering machines and buildings and all kinds of other things in the economy, which is sort of the basis of the economy. But if our interpretation of the economy isn't proper in thinking about that, then we'll have badly informed policy, and policy is there to affect social outcomes. And if we don't get the social outcomes we want, if we don't think that physical resources like energy are involved, then we'll misdiagnose the problem, and we won't think properly about it. So the book there is to summarize a lot of the work. Some of it's my work, but most of it is other people's research that's been going on to sort of explain this connection, and how we need to get past the, quote unquote, narratives of energy about pitting one energy technology versus another, fossil fuels versus renewables, and get beyond economic narratives of whether we can just kind of grow infinitely and there's no constraint, only our minds, versus thinking about the physical constraints that actually affect our choices.
So, okay, so I'm gonna try and read that back to you. So you're trying to connect the policy world and the physical world, I guess, would be one.
That's a good way, yeah.
One way to think about it, and point out the physical constraints in the systems. And I want to talk about the superorganism in just a minute, but you said that the purpose of this book at the beginning, you say to explain physical constraints, how physical constraints affect our social outcomes, in particular economic outcomes. A lack of understanding of these constraints pervades our politics, policy, business decisions, and economic theory. Thus, we're too often given hollow narratives. What are the hollow narratives?
Oh, the hollow narratives, I would say, let's just say, if you want to talk about, people talking about whether the future energy system should be continue to be fossil fuel based or to shift to renewables. The narratives are, we have the renewable technology we need. It's cheap enough, so switching over should be easy, or maybe not that painful in terms of economics,
but not
the
costly.
because the economic models tell me so. And on the other side, somebody would use the same economic theory, and I would say flawed framework, to say that fossil fuels say that the future should govern the future of energy, and we can go low carbon still by using fossil fuels. So no matter what you want on either extreme, the economics is sort of informing policy that all things are possible, and they're just not incorporating the sort of the timing and physical constraints of the energy system.
Well, let me jump ahead here, because in going through your book, I was and I'll challenge you kind of early on in the discussion here, but I was a little surprised that your book doesn't really reference the idea of the superorganism until 300 pages in, and you say that the coherent and combined energy and economic narrative is the following: the global economy is a superorganism. So, which is an interesting idea, but so you're viewing the economy as a living thing, not just a living thing, but a super living thing, right? That is exceeding its boundaries. Explore that, because I'd never seen this idea of the superorganism, and I was kind of in the first part of the book, I was saying, well, why is this book called a superorganism?
Yeah. Well, I guess I won't go into too many details. You're a writer, and you've written I can't remember, 8 books, and
a few.
Whether you're in charge of the title of your book. So yeah.
Well, fair enough. It's always a battle to find the right title, but never mind that. So what about the superorganism?
So, let's go into a couple of things. So one, you don't have to think of sort of defining the word living or non-living to think about the concept. And it's not about overcoming the boundaries. So I'm not proposing that we're overcoming boundaries. I'm proposing that we're operating within a boundary or within a physical boundary. For the most part, the Earth at the moment, although we send satellites into space and these kinds of things. But the idea, and I'm not the originator of the idea of the economy as a superorganism or even an information processing system, but it's an organism in the sense that it's composed of physical things, it's exposed to natural laws and has to follow them, and it takes in resources from its environment. So there is a boundary between the superorganism and everything else, which we'll just call the environment. It takes resources from the environment. It uses these resources to grow and structure itself. And it produces waste, of course. And that's basically how we think of human bodies or ant colonies and these other kinds of things. They're organisms or organisms of organisms, so we could call them superorganisms. That's commonly referred to things like bee colonies and ant colonies.
Sure.
And when you look at the rate of, say, resource consumption or energy consumption as it relates to the size of the organism, our economy follows similar principles and similar patterns as do living things. So ecologists and biologists have kind of been on this, for a while, and been thinking about it since the 70s and the oil crisis. And, how do we think about the economy? And it was natural for them to think about an entity that takes resources from the environment and uses them to grow and structure itself. So I've just kind of translated that and tried to explain how we think about the economy as something that's taking in resources. It's trying to grow, it's trying to maintain itself, and it has some structure. And economists would talk about structure, such as things like wage distribution, inequality, even debt levels. And so I'm attempting to say, we should be explaining these kinds of things in terms of the rate of energy consumption and
what those limits might be.
Right, including time. Like how long does it take to do something? Right, time is another constraining factor.
Sure. So, and the narratives, of course, is in the title, these competing narratives, but let's back up here, because I think it's helpful for the people who listen to this podcast. And I've been, I'm familiar with these terms for a while, but you start out in the first part of the book by quoting Richard Feynman, who of course won the Nobel Prize in Physics. And you point to his 1961 lecture, and where he's talking about the first law. And he says the first law of thermodynamics, it states that there is a certain quantity which we call energy that doesn't change in the manifold changes which nature undergoes. And then he says in its most abstract, it's a mathematical principle. So I'll just put it to you. Everybody, this idea is a very powerful one. It's the first law. What is the first law? If you don't mind, I'm going to ask you about the second law too, and then why these fit into, and then let's talk about energy and power, because these are fundamental to understanding our systems, right? And how the organism works.
Right. So the first law of thermodynamics is often stated as the conservation of energy. So there's a certain amount of a word we call energy, as Feynman says, is a construct that we came up with. So by assuming this construct that there is this concept we call energy, and at one time there's a certain amount of energy in a system that we define, and at some other time there's the same amount of energy in that system, even though stuff is transferred from one form of energy to another internally in the system. If we count it all up, we're going to get the same number. So that was an assumption, and that assumption has borne out to be true every time we test it. And by using that assumption, it has become a law because we haven't disproven it. And this allows us to design the world around us. By using this principle, the first law of thermodynamics, we can design computers and trains and cars and all kinds of things around us. It essentially, that's the proof on why we know it's true. If we didn't follow this principle in our designs wouldn't be working and flawed. But we're like, hey, when we follow this, everything seems to work and we can understand it.
Sure.
So there's another quote in the book from Howard Odum. That's a little bit more of an information processing kind of quote, but that a system can't understand itself. So there's this whole idea of, can we understand, what the economy is really for if we're part of the economy? So that in a high level philosophical sense, we can't totally understand it, but he says, well, we try to make models to understand as much as we can. Right. And the first law of thermodynamics and other principles are ways in which we do this.
So you had a good analogy there about a mother knowing that her son has 28 blocks.
That's Feynman. I just take it from him. Too,
okay, so. Right. Well, but so that was Feynman. But yeah, but the idea that no, the kid has 28 blocks. One of them might go missing. It might be under the bed, or you might not find it right away. But it's there, and it's always going to be there. It's just where how your ability to locate it. So okay, so the second law. You talk about Sadi Carnot and his experiments. What's the second law?
The second law is you cannot convert 100% of an energy source that you, say, take from the environment into work or into useful work, into some useful process, that some amount of this energy you extract from the environment has to turn into heat, and you can't make use of it. So you can't have a 100% efficient car engine or power plant or something like this. It's always going to convert less than 100% of the fuel into, say, electricity or motion of the car. Something like this.
Which matters to us because we're not going to, as you say, not going to get 100% of the energy out of the gasoline that we use. But it also matters then for batteries. Anytime you change the form of energy from one to another, something is going to be lost. And the more and the more you change it from one to another, the more losses you're going to incur. So, but that's basic. Okay, so let's move on. You talk about this idea being the concept of energy being a great leap forward. But you talk about the need to think about power. So I've written about this, thought about this, but please, what's the difference between energy and power?
The difference between energy and power is pretty much time. So you can say it in one word if you would like, but power is essentially how much energy has been consumed over a period of time, or you can think about the rate of consumption of energy. Energy is the amount of power that you have consumed over a period of time. So in a mathematical sense, you can integrate power across time to get energy, or you can take the derivative of energy with time and get power. So power is a rate, like the flowing water in a river. Energy is a quantity, a stock, like the amount of water in a lake.
Good. I like that. Yeah. As I said, energy is a sum and power is a rate, right? That you have a fixed quantity of energy, but you have to make it flow. And when you make it flow, you make power. And the faster you make it flow, the more power you have, right? So, but I also was intrigued by, you talked about the point about GDP early in the book, and about the fact that GDP is a measure, it's a rate. And so you're talking about economic growth as in a similar way as a power metric, which I hadn't thought of before, or maybe some other people have thought of it before, but I thought that that's a really, it's a really important point. So do we care about power, or do we care about energy, or are they inextricable?
Oh, I suppose we care about both. Yeah, so the point there, yeah, so GDP is money per year or money per unit time. So that's like a rate. And then power, of course, is energy per unit time. And we have words and phrases that we normally say in the industry, like energy intensity of the economy, which is, and so we think, oh, it's energy and GDP, but really it's power. It's the power intensity of the economy, or the energy per year consumed per year divided by the GDP produced in a year. So it's really a rate divided by a rate, even though we don't say it. So I'm just kind of emphasizing that, hey, that's what's really we're discussing. So when we talk about GDP, we're talking about a rate. If we talk about wealth of the economy, we're talking about a stock. And so those are two different things. That's kind of the difference between power and energy. So this gets in, that's the first step to get into the details about, well, okay, how much power do you need to keep operating the economy, and power at some time during the night or sometime during the day or average over the whole year. You can discuss all these different time frames, which is, one of the chapter discusses how time and how essentially I think the energy narratives talk past each other on issues like reliability of an energy supply, because they're just talking about different time frames. Are you talking about 1 second or 1 minute? Or are you talking about 4 decades? And you can have a different perspective. They're all valid time frames to talk about, and they're all important, but you get a different sort of perspective.
Sure. So your book, in looking at it, I mean, it's a technical book, but who's the target? Who do you want to read this book? Who's the audience?
Well, certainly people studying economics. I'd say people studying economics more than people studying energy, but really both. It's for reporters. It's for people that are in policy circles that need to interpret and understand, to say, journal articles. I mean, people in Congress, legislative staffers will rely on journal articles and scientific studies, peer-reviewed studies, to create legislation, and they'll use it as a basis for justification. And this book is a little bit of a step back from that. It's not as technical as a journal article. There's no equations and mathematics, but it's trying to explain, well, here's some of the really important assumptions that are behind reading results of someone's economic model about how to change the energy system. How are they assuming? What is the relationship between energy and the economy? And sometimes there's basically almost no relationship, and so it can be misleading. So I'm here trying to promote that knowledge so people are aware.
Sure.
I think, well, too many people are unaware of that.
So you divide in my takeaway from the book, is really what you see is this battle between the techno-optimists and the techno-realists. Are we really? And so, if you don't mind, what's the difference there? And is this? I'll ask a provocative question. Are we still arguing about whether Malthus was right? Because you talk about Malthus and it being a techno-realist versus Julian Simon being a techno-optimist, right? Is that a fair assessment?
That's probably fair enough.
Okay.
So
fair enough is all I want.
Well, I mean,
to be perfect.
I'll elaborate, but
sure.
Chapter 1 defines these 2 energy narratives and 2 economic narratives, and they're kind of meant in some sense to be straw man arguments. And then the economy as a superorganism is saying, okay, I don't need these straw man arguments to understand what's going on. I can use the consistent bits and pieces among them. So techno-optimism, or Julian Simon, and I quote Milton Friedman, and they would say things like, well, just look at prices of energy to determine if energy is scarce, and that's the signal you need. Well, prices are developed from a construct of how we define the economy and how we define how people can do transactions. And these can be fairly independent of the physical system. They're certainly reflective of what's going on in the physical environment, but we have to interpret how prices do or do not relate to the environment and extracting energy. And this is not clear. I use the example of, just things like dresses. I mean, people are familiar with the idea that the price of something can change dramatically, and it seems to have nothing to do with the physical environment. Like the price of a dress goes from $1,000 and then it's on sale the next day for $100. And well, how did that happen? Well, it doesn't cost. The price is different than cost. Price is what the market's trying to sell, and cost is something more fundamental about what it takes to actually make something. So the techno-realism says, well, let's think about whether the structure of the economy. So I think both are important. I emphasize size. What's the size of the economy? Say GDP is a most regular example. and structure. Structure could be anything about distribution of something, distribution of money amongst people, distribution of money amongst sectors of the economy, or people that own capital and people that work for a living. And I would, the extreme case of the techno-optimism is, well, we can create whatever in size and structure we want, somewhat independent of resources. And the techno-realism, I would say, is like, well, no, the rate at which we extract resources is going to put some constraints on us, and we might have to make trade-offs between size and structure, or we need to understand how size and structure are related to energy consumption. And the chart one chart I have in the book, and which I discuss in a paper I published earlier this year, shows, for example, the United States data for energy consumption per person. So it's kind of a rate of energy consumption on a per person level, and the wage share of GDP, which is how much money goes to wages and salaries, or people who work daily or hourly for a living, and how much of all of those wages and salaries added together divided by GDP, what percentage is that? So a high percentage would be a more equal income distribution, because the other income would be going to people that own things, like profits or capitalists, they might say. And so economists, obviously, we've been talking about, or in mainstream discussions for the last decades, since the financial crisis, for sure, has really picked up discussing wage inequality or income inequality. And so, but when you look at the data, right, there's been in the US, a declining income inequality since the early 1970s, and what changed in the 1970s? When you plot these two things next to each other, energy consumption per person was going up at, say, 4% a year until 1973 and oil embargo, and 1970 was peak oil production then at the time in the US. Energy consumption goes flat in the early 1970s per person, and wage share starts declining at the same time.
So if I can interrupt, because
I think those two things are related. Go ahead.
Right. Well, I think you said it. I just want to make sure that I heard you correctly. But I think you're, and I remember your paper. I think it came out in January, if I'm not mistaken, and you were talking about it and saying that this is indicative of a broader trend. But the way I interpreted that was that if per capita energy consumption is increasing, then working class folks are making more money. And when that stops, then the capitalists are making more money. Is that another way to think about it?
I don't know if I'd use R, but you say it's easier to make those things occur, or it's easier. So if energy consumption per person is increasing, I would say it's easier to distribute an expanding pie to, in some sense, all parties. Now, in the post-World War II years leading up to 1970, there were all kinds of laws put in place or still established from the New Deal. And unions, they would say, okay, there's more union bargaining power, and they had wages that were indexed with inflation. And so this was all part of them getting a larger share of the economic pie, and workers as a group.
Sure.
And this essentially kept going until early 1970. And then there were pressures on, inflation pressures on increasing wages. And it was making it harder for companies to maintain profits. And of course, due to oil price increases, the US as an entity was not in control of that particular aspect of inflation. And so the companies are kind of like, well, we're not in control of this energy inflation, yet the wages are supposed to go up. Something's got to give. And my interpretation is, well, something did give. We sort of changed the structure of how the US economy operates, for better or for worse. It didn't have to exactly happen that way, but in the US, this is the way it happened, which was a focus on profits of companies, and then in some sense the labor took the brunt of the structural changes.
So, okay, so let's go back to the techno-optimists versus the realists. In your book, I see this kind of tension where you're really trying to present both sides, right? And say, well, which side is what are the arguments? And using quotes, I'm mentioned in the book about land use. You talk Alex Epstein, other people that are writing about these issues. Well, so who's winning the narrative? I mean, if you break this down about, in just real politics today, because if you think about the Green New Deal, some of these other programs that are being proposed, you even look at Joe Biden's energy proposals, the techno realists, or the limits to growth people, I guess, or I guess I'm really simplifying it here, and also talking about the climate activists. They seem to be on the ascent. What's your view if you step back and say, well, who in among these narratives, which narrative is winning the day?
Right. Good question. So yeah, if we think about my, energy and economic narratives in chapter 1 are, two axes.
Right.
And so that means you got fossil and renewable, and then you got techno-optimism and realism. So you can have renewable techno-optimism, and you can have fossil energy techno-optimism. And so in that sense, I'm saying I would, just to answer your question, techno-optimism is still winning, or still the prevalent form of discussion, because the discussion will, and from IPCC reports or anything, is, well, of course we can go low carbon in 50 years or 40 years, and the economy, instead of growing, this much over the, from today until 2100 or something, and if we do this complete transformation, it's going to grow this much, a little bit less. And so it's like, it's this much versus this much. And so I look at that and I think we have no idea what the uncertainties about economic growth independent of climate change are probably beyond this, this small change. So I view that as techno-optimism. And for the most part, all of these economic models, over 95% of them that inform these kinds of policy studies and conclusions, if you want to go low carbon, are based upon flawed economic theories that just don't properly take into account the role of energy. So I'm not saying that, we shouldn't think about the climate. What I'm saying is, when we think about the climate, we need better economic frameworks.
Well, okay, so where do you find yourself in the camp here? If you're placing yourself on your T of left, right, up, down, I mean, where do you fit in this? Because I mentioned you're trying to be even-handed in the way you wrote the book, but certainly you have opinions about, was I guess. So do you think Malthus was right, or just hasn't been proven right yet? I mean, how do you place yourself on this continuum here?
Right. I think I state in the book, so hopefully I don't say wrong where I put myself in the book, but pretty much I'm in the middle of the energy, fossil to renewable, in the sense that I'm just trying to understand the system and how everything fits together. But I'm definitely more towards the, techno-realism camp. Somebody suggested I should call it techno-pessimism, and I was like, well, I don't think it's pessimistic. I think it's just the correct assessment of the situation. So I'm definitely more on the techno-realism camp. And, the idea of the superorganism is sort of, there's this entity, it's trying to grow and maintain itself, and it doesn't really care whether it uses fossil energy or renewable energy. It just wants to use the mix that helps it grow and maintain itself. And that's kind of a, what I would say, seems to take away agency from humans as controlling the system. Like, are we in control of ourselves? Are we in control of the economy? And most people think, well, we are. We're fully in control. I make tax laws. We invent technologies. But the book tries to open up the mind to people thinking about all kinds of stuff like artificial intelligence and genetics and evolution. And when you start thinking about these things, you start to question, okay, how much are we doing from our own free will or independent choice versus is there some other guiding factor that we just may not understand? Right?
Just along for the ride here, because I'm when it comes to that, that those two axes that you're pointing out, I think, well, I think I'm a realist when it comes to where we are with energy and technology. I think, are renewables going to grow? Yeah, they are. But a lot of my work, including in my latest book, my latest film, is, with so many billions of people living in energy poverty, they don't want to stay there. So that that we're going to use whatever energy is available, because people aren't going to be content to stay in the dark. So I don't know whether, if that, where that places me on the continuum. I guess somewhere in the middle. But I think that, it was interesting that even you say, well, these ideas of these two camps are a little bit of a straw man, but it seems it's also a continuation of an ongoing argument with, between Julian Simon and Paul Ehrlich, right? About, what are the limits? What is the price going to be? And then, well, is the price real? Or, as you pointed out before, well, the price isn't a perfect reflection of the world, right? Because there are inefficiencies in pricing, as we well know. So it's my own personal comment. So how do you describe your own politics then? Because the politics, of course, figure into this, right? On the left, and I'm not talking about your XY axis here, but left versus right. That on the left, as I see it here in the U.S. particular, and I think in Western Europe as well, the left is much more of in the Malthusian camp. I'll put it that way, right? The Sierra Club was the one who published the population bomb, right? So how do you fit your own politics into this, or in terms of this political divide?
Yeah, I'm not sure to answer that. I guess I like to try to be fairly political agnostic. Anybody who seems to be expressing views that are cognizant of how the economy actually works, I would be a big fan of. And so, in some sense, most of the politicians, for practical purposes, sort of gloss over this details, and maybe that's not the job of politicians to know these details, but the people informing them should be aware of some of these details, and that's a little bit what this is probably my book is more about. As politicians are using information and they need correct and more accurate information. Just let's say that how would you associate GDP with energy consumption? The research I highlight in the book, it's not mine, it's mostly from some Europeans, and in particular a guy, Robert Ayers, who I guess is an American, but worked in France for his career at INSEAD. This exploration, and there's a group of us studying this idea of useful work, which is really kind of like, work output in a thermodynamic sense from a machine. And if you add the different kinds of useful work that are produced in an economy, which would be like the mechanical drive from a car engine, the output of a motor, and electricity coming to the house. And if you plot that versus gross domestic product, it's almost 1-to-1. You get one more unit of useful work, you get one more unit of GDP. And this seems to have held for several countries in which they've looked at these data. And this is a much more powerful explanation of the linkage between the environment, which is extracting energy from the environment, technology, which is essentially the conversion efficiency at which you take energy resources and convert them to work, and then GDP, which starts to get into economics and social outcomes, at least to some degree. That's an entry point. And this is just not even recognized in, most economic studies. So when you talk about transforming the energy system, instead of talking about which fuels we should use or which energy technologies, we could talk about how much useful work will we be able to get if we start to change the energy technologies? Sure. And that's a much more precise and, in some sense, describing the data more elegant than just arguing about oil, coal versus wind and solar.
Sure. Okay. Well, you masterfully deflected the political question.
Yeah. I don't have to, I don't know. Where do I lean? I probably tend to lean a little bit left, just from being a scientist and thinking that at least in the U.S., the left side seems to want to pay a little bit more attention to scientific arguments. But yeah, and so I wrote this book not to tell people to think about scientific arguments by themselves, but to say, wait, you need to expand that. Think about the scientific concepts that we know of and apply them to the economy too. Don't just apply them to, are we harming the environment? Think about the economy. You got to think about both.
So if I reflect it back to you, then in terms of how you're looking at these issues, then your politics are about, your work is really focused on this idea, which I liked, the idea of useful work. That's what we're really after, right? That the energy input, as I've said before, I don't care whether I could put sawdust or ragu spaghetti sauce in my fuel tank of my car, as long as I press the pedal and it goes, and I don't really care, right?
Yeah, but that's pretty much the thought. And I did read your last book, and I think you expressed thoughts like that in the book, and I was like, yeah. Yeah, I agree with Robert.
Attaboy. But that idea about useful work being the key, right, to wealth, right, and that's one of the reasons why electricity, of course, is so valuable, right, because we can convert it into all kinds of useful work at extremely high efficiency with no odor, no mess at the end point. So is that really what we're after? I mean, I want to tease that point out a little bit, because I think it's a really important distinction about that. What this grid that we've been talking about, the XY, that whether you're an optimist or a realist or wherever you fit on that spectrum, the end goal is always the same, right? How can we get more useful work out of what it is that we're doing, right? With at the lowest cost, at the highest benefit. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair, and this is a great point worth unpacking. So a premise of the book is, is that all we're trying to do unconsciously as a group, as a society of humans? Are we just like every ecosystem that seems to be trying to extract as much energy from the environment as possible at some rate, which is really power, and convert it into more mass of the animal, more mass of the ant colony? And are we just trying to do that for the economy? So that's kind of the hypothesis. And by looking at the data, my conclusion is that hypothesis is probably not disproved. That hypothesis appears correct so far. And the question is, can we thwart that? Can we overcome that? And should we overcome that? So there's an idea in ecology that was brought up by Alfred Lotka that I mentioned in the 1920s, and then also promoted by an ecologist named Howard Odum in his career in the 50s and 60s. And he called it the maximum power principle, and other people have talked about this, including Charles Hall, an ecologist as well. And so the maximum power principle is kind of saying, well, the part of the ecosystem overall, each individual part of an ecosystem is trying to extract resources or power from the environment. And when it does this, it's able to maintain itself more effectively. And if it maintains itself more effectively, it can survive to reproduce and pass on its genes. So the organism.
Going back, to the organism. I mean, I'm bringing back to your title, right? That's what the organism is going to do.
Yeah. So the organisms that survive are by definition the ones that procreate and have their young survive. That's the definition of surviving. And so the thought there is, well, the more power you extract from the environment, the more likely you are to survive and pass on genes. And then you could argue that the purpose of, living things is to just pass on information in genes, if you want. That's kind of the selfish gene idea. And so if you translate that to the economy, you can think about countries versus other countries. Which country extracts more power from the environment? Is that country more likely to survive in an economic sense versus another? Is this a driver to why it's hard to reduce energy consumption, which is part of the equation for reducing potentially useful work? So really the country that produces the most useful work is in some sense the most powerful. And I express quotes from military officials in the book discussing this, and anthropologists thinking about this in terms of societal structures. This really is sort of the question. And if we want to address climate change, there's some in the camp, maybe you might call them Malthusian, that would say, well, you just have to reduce consumption. If we reduce consumption, we'll reduce energy consumption, extraction, and emissions. We know that can happen because we've seen it in the data. We know if we do less activity and produce less useful work, we'll have less emissions. And so the catch on this is, okay, well, can you actually increase GDP or keep it constant or keep well-being, increase well-being? Before I state this, I do think that we can increase most human well-being without increasing GDP necessarily, and that's the structure part. That's the more equal distribution part. But can I increase GDP and decrease useful work or decrease emissions? This is the question. And the techno-optimists would say, yes, we can, and try to make arguments that say we have done this already in some cases. And I in the book say, no, I don't think we have evidence that we've yet increased a metric of growth and decreased energy consumption for sure. We haven't done that.
Right.
And
but the distinction there would be as you say that, I'm thinking, well, the distinction between energy and not a decrease in energy, but potentially a decrease in carbon-based energy? Because it seems to me, as you said that, I immediately thought, when I didn't think about this, I didn't want it included in my questions, but among the techno-optimists would be the nuclear enthusiasts, right? So, and I'm adamantly pro-nuclear, but I'm also, very clear that I write in my book, there are a ton of obstacles to making nuclear grow at anything like the scale that is needed now globally. I'm talking about terawatt scale. So I'll ask the question. So how do you fit the nuclear sector? I know your book isn't necessarily about nuclear, but how do you fit that, growing enthusiasm among climate activists and the Democratic Party? Even this year, they, for the first time, embraced nuclear in their party platform. How does nuclear fit into this this techno-optimism, techno-realism debate?
Yeah, in the book, as you kind of point out, I sort of punted on much detail on nuclear. It's kind of its own.
It's
complicated.
It's complicated.
Yeah, but certain things are on the up. I'd say things for the optimism side on nuclear have moved in the up direction, I guess, given particularly NuScale's ruling from the nuclear
sure, and
so
Oklo and some of these other recent announcements. Yeah.
And so potentially have the small nuclear reactors a little bit more on the horizon now. It's getting a little bit more close to real, and I think that's kind of what's needed. I don't. It's the independent of small modular reactors. Nuclear, I say, is probably not going to play a big role in the short term, but it could in the medium term. If we really get serious about lowering carbon emissions, you're going to get pretty far with solar, wind, batteries, and gas mix. And we pretty much have the solar, wind, and gas. I'd say I'm agreeing with the optimists that those are good enough to do a lot of things to get us, 60, 70% of electricity decarbonization there. Then you got some gas. It's that last bit. That's when you're going to start to think about, okay, yeah, maybe I want some nuclear. And it's really going to be a battle between, storage and nuclear type costs, I think. And I guess there'll be a mix of that. I have no idea. But the big nuclear plant is a really tough one. The current designs, at least in the Western world, it's still happening in other countries. If you take a big chunk of coal away, then maybe someone says, okay, I'm going to look ahead enough to have a 10-year build out of some new nuclear facilities to go after that.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I just think that with electricity consumption in the United States now flat for 15 years, it's a whole different environment than it was in the 60s, 70s, and even the 80s when new nuclear plants were being built. So in the electric sector in the U.S., it's a lot of competition among a lot of players just looking for a piece of a pie that's not growing at all. And right. So that I think go ahead.
Yeah. So the benefit is, I think I say this in the book, big is sort of hard and out, and nuclear as current technology, it has to be huge. It's so big, huge, it can bankrupt a company. So, that's just too big when, if you're an investor or a developer, you can do 10 different nuclear, solar and wind projects, or 20 or 30 of them instead of one big nuclear one. You spread your risk around, and we can keep integrating these things effectively at the moment. So when we'll keep approaching more difficulties in the grid and managing stuff, but so far the grid operators are managing it pretty well.
Sure. Well, you mentioned natural gas. So I mentioned nuclear. I've been talking about nuclear and natural gas for a long time. So then, and this isn't necessarily pertaining directly to the points that you make in your book, but when I look at the growth in gas production globally, the gas discoveries globally, it looks, put me in the optimist camp when it comes to the growth of natural gas. What's your view on that?
Yeah. I'll say one thing, and then if I don't answer your question right, then you can ask me again. One thing in terms of I often think of gas as sort of from a techno-optimism perspective, if I were to really sort of poke at that straw man, I would say, hey, if we thought natural gas in the United States was going to be $2 or $3 a million BTU at the hub, and if we thought about this 12 years ago, when people were really talking about climate legislation, would you say, oh, great, if that happens, we're for sure going to put carbon capture on all kinds of natural gas plants, and that's still going to be cheap enough for people, and then we're going to have low carbon from gas. Okay, well, that's not happening, right? We have this cheap gas, and we're not putting all this carbon capture stuff, or we're not experimenting enough and doing demonstrations to really figure it out fast enough. So I would say, if you're really in the techno-optimist camp, you're like, well, why aren't we doing that? It's pretty cheap. It would still be not egregiously expensive, probably, to put carbon capture on gas plants. Why aren't we doing that? The superorganism concept says, well, if you did that, that would be less useful work. And that would be less growth, because there's a little bit of efficiency hit when you're doing carbon capture. So is the organism about growth, or is the organism about low carbon? And so far, the organism is about growth. So we have to sort of overcome. The question is really, are we going to recognize this sort of maximum power principle organism types of drivers and then specifically constrain ourselves, or are we just going to pretend that that's not happening? So the book is a little bit there to talk about that. Of course, there are things.
Well, if I can interrupt about that constraint idea, because you say, well, there's a little bit of a constraint, from everything that I know, when you talk about carbon capture with natural gas plants, you're talking about a 25 to 30% parasitic load right off the top, right? In the overall output of the plant. So that's a significant hit for any organism, right? To say, oh, well, I'm going to cut my diet by 25%. I mean, that's a big number, especially if you're going to translate it into dollars for investors. And how do they justify that part of it? And then I haven't even talked about the pipelines that go downstream and carry this gas to somewhere. We don't know exactly where yet, but presumably that is going to find a home somewhere. So, but let me ask the question again. So, I mean, on a macro scale, because I'm not afraid to ask the question again. Where do you see the gas market going globally? Do you see this growing? If nuclear is constrained, as we just discussed, what does it mean? What does that mean for gas?
I get more about the nuclear situation, and I listened to one of your recent podcasts about the global versus sort of Western world, we might say, or developed world situation. So I won't expand on that. That nuclear seems to be happening in developing world and Middle East and these kinds of places, in China. But in terms of gas, so far, the accessible resources seem to be expanding. We're certainly using more in the U.S. I think you literally have to specifically, in some sense, constrain yourself to not continue that. Now, I'm a sort of finite earther enough to say that, well, that's not going to occur forever anyway, but we certainly still have a lot we can do with gas. So the constraints you would have to put on yourself because of the climate, environmental or greenhouse gas type constraint would be, these are, in chapter 9, I talk about, degrees of freedom of things we can do. And as we invent more technologies, there are more degrees of freedom of options, and you literally have to take some away. You can use gas, but you can't do it like this, or you can't do it like that. Right. And you would have to do things like, okay, you can use gas to take the hydrogens off and capture the carbon and store it underground, and then do whatever you want with hydrogen. Or you have to, if you generate electricity, you have to capture a certain amount of carbon. So we're kind of going past the coal, because coal is kind of going away, at least in the Western world. So who's going to invest in carbon capture on a coal plant that you don't know when you're going to retire anytime soon? So it really should shift to gas and say, okay, are we really going to do this? And it's, I talk about the difference between price and cost and total energy expenditures. And most economists will just kind of look at price and say, here's the dollar per ton that it's probably going to cost to capture from gas or coal plant or something like this. But we should really think about total expenditures of the economy. How much of our expending on, if we add up all of our spending on energy and compare that to the size of the economy, how much is that? Because that's a combination of all these prices and all these different technologies. That's the superorganism feedback that really occurs, is spending on energy,
right,
relative to the economy. And the data show that since World War II, if there's a time in which the U.S. and the global economy kind of match each other, spend more than 8% of GDP on primary energy, this has been associated with recession. And so this gets into the understanding of the feedbacks. How fast do you invest in the energy system? How does that impact how much we're spending? Because if you invest quickly, you're going to pay people for those jobs and you're going to build stuff, and that's going to get passed on through the energy costs. And that's okay. That's just how it works. But we have to recognize that.
But if the energy costs go up, the superorganism has to slow down.
You could transition fast enough such that you reach this kind of threshold in total expenditures, and you would cause a recession. You cause the other part of the economy to shrink to such a degree that you have a recession. And to me, that's not something to say it's false. It's something to say, oh, this is what could really happen, and we need to understand that and embrace it, and plan accordingly. And maybe we say that's okay. Maybe we say, well, why don't we just plan on a constant? One option you could say, as a kind of simple argument, why don't we just keep a constant level of GDP spending or try to target a constant level of GDP spending on energy relative to GDP, or figure out what that number is and have a constant level of GDP and transform the economy to low carbon, where the economy is not shrinking or growing. We're just trying to maintain some level. And if it's, if we're transforming the economy really quickly, but if you slightly go towards recession, you can maybe cut back on a little spending. If you go a little bit more towards growth, you can maybe spend more.
So, okay. Well, so when I hear you say that, I'm thinking in my own head of Federal Reserve setting interest rates or something, but it also smacks a little bit, and I'm just, off the top of my head saying, well, it smacks kind of more of central planning, right? That the superorganism, some of this individual agency of investors or individuals is going to be taken away because some group is going to say, well, this is our ideal for energy pricing or energy spending, and we're going to decide that, not you. And that relates to my next question about ESG, but is that fair, right? That some of what you're saying, it implies that there's going to be a need for more central planning as it comes to energy development or energy spending. Is that fair?
I don't know if I would characterize what I said as central planning, but you could pose it as a constraint on the system, which is right. Somebody has to do it. So a government would say, we're just going to have this constraint, which is different than dictating all of the individual actions that would occur to meet that constraint. There are many ways to meet the constraint. So you don't have to dictate the ways, but you do have to, in some sense. I mean, that's what we're talking about with climate, is setting a constraint, and having a hard time doing that. We're having a hard time forcing ourselves to do that.
Well, exactly. Right. And so, and I guess one of the examples of that, and I don't necessarily think this is central planning, although it does require coordinated effort, would be a carbon tax, right? That this is one of the things been talked about now for decades, never enacted at least federally. But that would be one aspect potentially of this broader kind of, I'm not going to say sensibility, a broader approach to energy as the key input for the society. Is that fair? How do you see that issue of the carbon tax fitting into this superorganism discussion?
Yeah, well, it would be probably imposing. If we wanted to try that, I'm for going ahead and trying this and trying the carbon tax, and let's see how it can work. I'm for that more than doing something like cap and trade. Let's just minimize the transactions in the financial markets and all these kinds of things, and just try to go to the core issue as much as possible. But yeah, carbon tax would is sort of has no analogy in the biological or ecosystem type of world. We don't know of an organism in biology that's saying, well, I could do this, but I'm gonna add this little feedback from the environment to me to prevent me from destroying my environment. In some sense, they might just take as much of the environment as they can, and then they get to some place where like, okay, I can't take anymore, or it's getting too hard. I have to spend too much energy to expand further. So this is kind of my boundary and limits. So we're kind of saying, well, I can keep expanding the economy, but I should put an extra constraint on myself, carbon related. And carbon tax is one way to do that.
Huh. Well, that's an interesting one, because I'm thinking about an animal, right? Oh, instead of the coyote going right after the rabbit, it's going to say, well, I'm going to do a couple laps before I chase the rabbit or something, just to make it a little more difficult or something. But now I'm really getting off into the weeds. Well, let me do a quick.
Go ahead. It would be like, well, I'm hungry enough to eat 3 rabbits, but I can get by with just 2. So I'm going to
Okay.
maybe more like
Fair enough. Let me interrupt for the commercial. I'm talking with Carey King, is the author of the new book, The Economic Superorganism, Beyond the Competing Narratives on Energy, Growth, and Policy. You can find him on the interweb at careyking.com. He's on Twitter at Carey W. King, at Carey W. King, Carey. So, Carey, we've been talking for a while here. I'm just going to hit you with a few more questions because now we're talking about these constraints on the system, on constraints on the organism, the idea of the energy economic organism as a living thing. And toward the end of the book, you talk about ESG, environmental, social, and governance investing. Could ESG, and we just talked about carbon tax, but could ESG then end up being maybe a bigger factor than any of these other things that we've been talking about? Because we've seen BP say they're going to reduce their spending on hydrocarbons. Shell has done the same, and that seems to be motivated by ESG concerns. Where do you see look into your crystal ball or your ESG crystal ball? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, you could be correct, or the supposition that ESG type investing could be the thing that directs the needle towards more low carbon versus government action, say. It's certainly a fairly independent type. I mean, they're affected by tax law, so it's not totally independent. And if it's mostly in the Western world, then somebody might argue, well, you're not affecting, however much 70% or 50% of the investment in the world. But, somebody's got to, in some sense, show the way.
Right.
So it seems promising in some sense. So I think it's an option if companies are literally diverting money that they would have had, let's just say, for oil and gas exploration into something else. In some sense, by definition, they're not going to have the resources. They're not going to find the resources to extract in the future. So that's kind of in some sense, that's paying attention to the physical nature of the economy and saying, well, I'm just not even going to go look for these things over here. I'm going to go make these other things that I think are better options. I guess I don't expect it to be easy. I don't study in detail papers and reports that say, well, look at these people who did invest in ESG and they invested from coal and oil and they did better in the stock market than otherwise, or something like that. I don't focus on that a lot, but because I think about the whole system and organism and interconnectedness, I'm not sure how much weight I put in those kinds of studies. In the sense of not everybody's Apple and designed in California and made in China.
Right.
We have to think about that's how it really works. And the internet companies are becoming big.
But they're big electricity use.
Not because they're specifically doing something about carbon, just because they're doing something that's another part of the economy.
Right. At the end of the book, you talk about efficiency, and we've talked about voluntary reductions, and ESG, I guess, would be a type of voluntary reduction. A carbon tax would be a similar kind of maybe compelled, but it's a factor that would be added to the system, right? In some ways, voluntary. But you say toward the end of the book, the most certain way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is to reduce consumption of physical resources. But we seem unwilling so far, you put in parentheses, to self-impose this constraint. One of the main reasons is because the techno-optimistic and infinite substitutability economic narrative, which dominates economic thinking and thus also policy design, says we don't have to. It does not contemplate physical constraints on long-term growth. So let me push back on that in this way, in that it seems to me, isn't the reason that we, and I'm using the papal we, everybody and me and we in Vietnam and Bangladesh and Pakistan, and you too, that we aren't reducing our consumption of steak dinners or airplane trips to Bali or wherever, because that's not in our nature. I mean, it's just not who we are, right? We're not going to say, oh, I'm going to go out and I'm going to do less today, right? It just doesn't seem like it seems like a little conflict in terms of how individuals and countries do what they do. I mean, is that fair? Am I often am I misapprehending what you're saying there, or am I beating my own soapbox here?
That's probably fair. I'll try to say a couple things on that.
Sure.
So one thing, this kind of relates to an idea of emergence, or the scientific concept of emergence, which I'll come back to. But I use a quote, I think from Nate Higgins, who thinks along these lines, and who's also been a thinker on this idea of the superorganism and how do you sort of thwart that tendency. But the quote from him I put in the book, I may not get particularly correct, is none of us is at fault, but all of us are to blame.
Yeah.
So we're all underlying doing something, and when you add up everything we're doing, we end up with something we call the economy or total consumption. So this gets into thinking about complexity science and this idea of emergence, which is there are patterns you can see at big scales, like to say the macroeconomic scale. I can see these patterns emerging of how energy consumption relates to GDP, and that this follows similar trends that we see in ecosystems. And so that's kind of the idea of emergence. Each one of us isn't consciously thinking about that pattern. We're not trying to produce that pattern. Nobody's thinking about it consciously, but that pattern emerges in some sense. So you can't understand how this pattern emerges by just looking at the individual actions. You have to think about how the individual actions are integrated, as well as what the constraints are on these actions. And it's the physical constraints of operating under the thermodynamic laws and physical principles that are behind how these patterns emerge. And so this is, completely pretty much far from policy, but it needs to be integrated into economics. And one simple way to do this, not in terms of the patterns, is to think about efficiency. You talk about efficiency, and I'm a big, I think that more efficiency leads to growth. So more growth, I'll just say that, not less growth or less consumption. So that's Jevons paradox and all this kind of thing. So all the evidence, points to that. And
just to be clear, all the evidence points to that efficiency is positive in the economy. Is that, I just want to make sure what you're referring to.
I won't use the word positive or negative, but I'll say that increases in efficiency lead to more consumption of energy.
Okay, yeah, right. And so the Jevons paradox, William Stanley Jevons showed that increasing efficiency doesn't necessarily reduce consumption of coal, and increased it. And he published his book, 1865, The Coal Question. Anyway, quick aside, just so everybody is following here.
So here's, this in some sense, this is an emergent concept. So each individual process, each computer, each car, something like this, can literally consume less energy to do the same amount of service, to drive a mile down the road. But if there were no more cars built, then we would consume, less energy. But there aren't no more cars built, and there aren't no more people born. There are more people born, and there are more cars built to support them. And that's why you get an increase in consumption. So you literally have to think about time, which is generally not present in most economic models in a fundamental way, and the concept of, evolution. They do think about investment and accumulating things, accumulating more capital. But more directly to efficiency, efficiency is essentially, seems to be the best description of what economists would call productivity, or more detailed, total factor productivity in the neoclassical growth model. And so this neoclassical growth model is what's behind the vast majority of economic models that study energy transitions, including those that inform the IPCC. And so most people talk about total factor productivity in terms of all kinds of things. It's by definition the part of economic growth that's not accounted for by a metric of capital and a metric of labor. So how much money goes to pay wages and how much money goes to profits. But it's a huge number. It's like half of all economic growth. So the normal economic model that is used to think about energy transitions, for example, but it thinks about all kinds of other economic policies, or it's used for those purposes, basically can't explain half of economic growth. But when you look at total factor productivity, how it's changed, and then you look at how efficiency changes from year to year, those are almost one-to-one. So essentially, this missing factor in mainstream economic growth theory is effectively how much are we increasing the efficiency of conversion of resources to useful work. And so then that leads us back to useful work. And so that's something you can count. It's not just this nebulous thing like people are smarter, or innovation as a word, and we don't know what innovation is. We just say innovation or say technology. Right. It's an actual specific thing we can track and metric. It's tedious, but you can do it. And the people that have done this, I think have shown this to be, I would say, this is the hypothesis or the theory that has to be disproved at this point in my mind. And so I'm, I'm involved with these people studying this further.
Okay, so just to be clear, then I'm trying to read back what I've heard you say, and what the question I was asking was: is it reasonable to assume that the we collective we are going to use less? And as I heard you talking about what you just said, that our hope then in using less is through greater to try and strive for greater efficiency of consumption, to achieve more useful work for every and output with everything we use. Is that am I hearing you right?
Well, I'll say, I guess, and you asked me about Malthus earlier. I'll just go back to that. I'm Malthusian enough to say that we're not going to grow forever, and one of the reasons will be I could be we somehow figure out how to constrain ourselves by choice,
voluntary constraint,
restrict our degrees of freedom, or we grow until we just can't. The size of our system has filled up the environment so much that we can no longer profitably extract from the environment and grow. We'll just reach some maximum limit. So one of those two is going to occur. And so the question is whether we try to just not reach the maximum by choice, by imposing some constraint. So you could say, well, we're going to try to maximize efficiency as much as possible, but you would have to add some extra restriction on yourself to not just grow for the sake of growing, but you could say, well, if I want efficiency to lower carbon emissions, I'm actually going to have to prevent increases in consumption that can arise because we got more efficient, and then that made it more affordable. Yeah. You'd actually just have to.
So either there's going to either we're going to have some collective wisdom and agreement to try to use less, or those limits will effectively be pushed on us. And I guess that maybe that. I mean that maybe it's almost too obvious to say it, but that's what I just heard you say. Is that fair?
I think what you said is fair. I mean, and the difficulty here and sort of the narratives is, you'll find plenty of peer-reviewed economic articles that say, no, this Jevons paradox thing, this idea of efficiency for getting more consumption doesn't happen. Look, I've done this analysis and it doesn't happen.
Right.
But any analysis that only takes part of the economic system and looks at it like just looking at my house or looking at the city of Austin, you're missing the point. The point is you have to think about the whole system. And when you look at the whole global economy, we have gotten more efficient and we are consuming more.
Right. So toward that end, let me add one thing, because we haven't talked about this. I was looking at the Energy Institute website, or I got your email, in fact, from this morning, about this energy infrastructure dashboard that now you have up at the Energy Institute. What's the? I don't have that URL. Can they, if they Google energy infrastructure dashboard, will that take them to it?
You can look up energy infrastructure of the future, or if you go to the Energy Institute website, which is energy.utexas.edu. There is a link to policy studies, and one of the links from the policy studies button goes to energy infrastructure of the future. And then that takes you to this dashboard in which we let people select certain things to change about the future of energy for 13 regions of the United States to the year 2050. And then we actually do some calculations on the back end, goes to a server somewhere, calculates, consumes electricity, spits out carbon when it does these calculations, and gives you the results. And so it's a way for people to explore on their own with some fidelity. You can compare, the Biden plan or something like this, or try to go low carbon in the electricity system and see what happens. It's not everything you could change about the energy system by any means, but it's a select set of things that we think are pretty informative, and we've been working on it for the last 3 years and just launched it in the last month. And there's tutorials and webinars and example reports. One of the good features is you can run your scenario and you can save your scenario as a PDF file, and then send it to all your friends and say, here's mine and here's what I think, or send it to your legislator. You're like, here's what you can do.
And I noodled around with it just a little bit this morning, and just looked at Texas, and then you can put in what percentage of the electricity mix you want from natural gas, how much from nuclear, how much geothermal, how much wind, how much solar, and then it gives you a land use calculation as well. So I thought it was really, it was very clever, and I thought it
I
was.
did that for you. I put the land use for you in there.
Thank you very kindly.
It's a pretty back of the envelope, but at least it's a number. Yeah.
But at least it's a number, and it makes some, it's tied to something, in reality. And I'm very focused on the land use issues because, I continue to follow. In the Israelis just rejected a wind project in the Golan Heights. There was another project Gage County, Nebraska rejected a wind project. Christian County, Illinois essentially banned wind projects. The land use issue is big. So anyway, I won't beat my own drum. I'm here to interview you. So yes, thank you for the land use calculations on the energy.
I forgot to mention in my newsletter that just recently went out, as you said, that there was a webinar I did for the United States Association for Energy Economics with Varun Rai here at the Energy Institute, the director, and Armin Cohen of Clean Air Task Force. And we talked about the tool. I didn't put a link to it in my newsletter. I should have done that. But we do talk about land use and this Clean Air Task Force. They look at this in some pretty good detail and are associated with researchers looking at it in detail. And yeah, as you say, you can get to pretty low percentages of land use for, say, citing infrastructure in general, but they're focused on wind and solar. You get to a few percentages in a state, and it starts to become it can become pretty difficult in terms of actually putting it somewhere.
Sure. So just two more things. So Carey, what are you reading these days? I mean, I know you're reading a lot, but what do you read when you're not working? Any books you recommend? Who do you enjoy reading?
Right. Well, yeah, I did about a reading for the book and haven't read as much since then, but the last book I read was The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton. I just kind of finished that. That's just about some modern monetary theory.
Oh, right. The modern from Stony Brook. Is that right? Yeah, right. Yeah.
There's a whole group of them that used to be at University of Missouri, Kansas City. And so, yeah, it's about, the role of public spending, how the federal government spending money is much different than banks creating money through loans and credit. And these are, it's a very important distinction, and I'm looking to incorporate, I incorporate these distinctions I'm looking to in my own economic modeling of the energy system. I got The Great Leveler by Walter Scheidel. That's how you say his name. That's kind of about how inequality has changed. And essentially, you need some sort of, or not you need, but historically, there's been some sort of famine or war or economic calamity that has been the trigger for an increase in inequality. And when you have stability, you tend to increase inequality with stability. So that's relevant for thinking about today. Another fun books are Donald Hoffman's The Case Against Reality, which I read to inform my book and some of his papers. That's just trying to think about, do we really know how we're making decisions? And do we really perceive the world? What we see in the world, is that really what's happening? And do we know what's happening? So
no Tom Clancy, in other words, here. I don't hear any
I know I tend to read things that are more, science and philosophy that can inform how I perform economic modeling. Another book that I really enjoyed that informed my book was, and I listened to his podcast, Sean Carroll's The Big Picture. And I mentioned some of the ideas he emphasized about the philosophy of naturalism. And, if you don't buy into naturalism, you're sort of buying into supernaturalism. So naturalism is, what we observe in the environment is the only thing that we have to base our decision.
The big picture. The Big Picture is what it's called.
Yeah, his book is called this book is called The Big Picture. And so if you're not going to use what you observe and what you know how to observe and test in the environment, what's going on around the world, what else are you using to govern your decision making? And so it's kind of, in my philosophy of thinking.
Sure.
That's how you can understand the world, by testing it and observing things, and then you try to check if your observations are correct. And so, the natural world is the only thing we have to look at and understand how things are going. So
that sounds interesting. Yeah, that's I haven't heard that all. So one last, again, it's Carey King, the author of the Economic Superorganism: Beyond the Competing Narratives on Energy Growth and Policy. So last question for you: what gives you hope?
What gives me hope? Well, that I'd say we're not, in a superorganism sense, we're not necessarily in charge of knowing or exactly projecting or predicting how big the economy is going to be, how much stuff we're going to consume. these kind of things. But what we are in control of much more directly is distribution. And so I am hopeful that we'll just start to focus more on distribution, uh, how we distribute the proceeds of the economy, rather than the size of the economy. And I think discussions are slowly moving in this direction. Um, Whether people can move away from saying, well, in order to distribute more evenly, I have to grow. You got to move away from that. So I'm hopeful that we can move away from that because people are getting beyond GDP, as they say. There's a lot of discussions of getting away from GDP as a metric. I still think GDP is valuable because it does seem to be a metric that represents the physical, to some degree, physical output of the economy, but physical output of the economy is not everything we need to know. And certainly it's not a metric of well-being. So if we focus on, well-being and distribution, I'm hopeful that we're moving in that direction. And if we get there, it'll be easier to tackle climate, I think.
Good. Well, that's a good place to stop. Anything that I've failed to mention or bring up, Carey, you want to talk about?
No, I guess not. Hopefully check out the book. CareyKing.com is my website. And thanks for having me. Yeah, it's been great.
Glad to do it. Carey King is the author of The Economic Superorganism, Beyond the Competing Narratives on Energy Growth and Policy. It's published by Springer. It's available on Amazon. He's on Twitter at Carey W. King. Carey, thanks a million for being on the podcast. Thanks to all of you for listening. And I will see you next time on the Power Hungry Podcast.